Thanks everybody for joining this webinar. This is a ETI Insights webinar. We can see the room slowly filling up with participants. That's great to see. We'll give it another minute or two just to make sure everybody's in the room and then we'll kick off. So thank you everyone for joining this ETI Insights webinar today. According to my clock, it's about 1 minute past the hour. So I think we'll start the session, and I'm sure a few more people will join as we get going. So welcome everybody to this session. This is all about just transitions in manufacturing. And we will be sharing some of the lessons that we've been learning over the last year, working closely with the SMEP program to integrate human rights and environmental sustainability. The SMEP program is a program supported by UK government's UK International Development Aid budget and supported by the UN Trade and Development Agency, UNCTAD, with technical support as well. So, just a couple of points around housekeeping before we get going with the content itself. So just so you're aware, you should have been informed when you joined that this session is being recorded. We will make the recording of this session available online later this week. So anybody who signed up but was unable to join this morning can listen in future. As such, this is a public webinar, so we're not using Chatham House rules. So please just be aware of that when you're sharing your kind of comments and questions. We're going to be using the Q&A function throughout the session today. You should see a button towards the bottom of your screen that says Q&A on it. Please use that to ask any questions that you have, to share any reflections, to provide any feedback. We will be monitoring that throughout the webinar, and we will direct specific questions towards the right person to provide you with an answer. So please do interact with us today and use the Q&A function as much as you'd like. This is today's agenda. I'm going to provide an introduction to ETI, to the concept of just transitions, and then a very brief high-level overview of SMEP. My name is George, and I'm the Just Transitions Advisor here at ETI. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Ipek, who is our Global Partnerships Officer, who's been working very closely with the SMEP program over the last year, supporting grantees to integrate decent work and safeguarding into their programs and projects. And she's going to share some of the key lessons that we've learned from that work. We'll then hand over to Faith, and Faith is the Jessie lead at South South North. South South North is one of the firms providing the program management support to SMEP. Faith will dive deeper into some of these gender equality and social inclusion lessons and achievements of the SMEP program. And then we'll dive even deeper and hand over to V, who joins us from River Recycle. River Recycle is one of the grantees supported by the SMEP program, and she'll be talking about their work to integrate decent work and safeguarding in their project in Ghana. We'll then zoom out slightly and hand over to Glenn, who joins us from UNCTAD. Glenn is a program management officer at UNCTAD, the UN Trade and Development Agency, and he'll provide some insights from their perspective as the technical partner on this program. And then we'll wrap up and hopefully be done within the hour. So that's the agenda for today. I hope that all makes sense. Very briefly, who are we? We are ETI, the Ethical Trading Initiative. We're a membership organization established back at the end of the 1990s. You may have come across the ETI base code at factories and supplier sites in many parts of the world. We are a tripartite human rights organization. So our members include NGOs, trade unions, and companies, all committed to safeguarding human rights in global supply chains. And that tripartite structure is reflected at our governance level as well. We aim to provide practical advice and guidance on the implementation of human rights due diligence in global supply chains, and we convene our members and wider stakeholders in a safe space um, to support them to address the most salient human rights issues in their supply chains. Before we get going on the content of today's webinar, we wanted to get a bit of a sense of who's with us today in the room, and what your perspectives on some of these key issues are. So you should be able to use your mobile to scan the QR code on the screen there, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code there, which is 74875771. And you'll be asked the question, what worries you most? Is it poor working conditions or biodiversity loss or climate change or pollution, or perhaps it's something else? Perhaps it's all of the above. And just to give us a bit of a sense of who's joining us and what their concerns are, we thought we'd start with this question. So I can see the scores are coming in. Around 30 respondents so far. So we'll give it another minute or two and see what's top of the agenda, or at least front of your mind today. Okay, so we've got about 67 respondents so far. It's still ticking upwards, but we can see that poor working conditions are the number one worry, shall we say, for participants in the webinar today, followed by climate change, and then actually closely followed by all of the above, which would include poor working conditions, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Interestingly, pollution is down towards the bottom there. Of course, there are many things worrying us these days. We live in somewhat uncertain times, so I'm sure there are many other things as well. Please do type those in the chat as well, so we have a sense of what's on your mind. But this is useful for us to see. So definitely, poor working conditions are a major concern for people on the call today. Perhaps we can go to the next question. And this is more of an open-ended one, and hopefully we'll start to see a bit of a word cloud being generated by Menti on the screen here in just a minute. As mentioned, this webinar is all about just transitions in manufacturing. So just to get a bit of a sense of what just transitions means to you, please do scan the QR code if you haven't done so already, and answer this question, and we'll see what words start to appear. So really nice to see some stuff flowing through already. So I can see words like fair and fairness and equity and ethical, opportunity is on there, inclusive is on there. It just keeps moving, so it is quite hard to keep track of. But it's really nice to see some of these terms. I see somebody's added "leave no one behind." Obviously, that's a key one. I think I just saw the right to a safe environment appear. There's mention of indigenous rights in there as well, really important topic, and one that often gets overlooked, sadly. I think somebody said trade unions, somebody else has said people, somebody said change. Efficiency, I think, appears there, which is an interesting one. I think I can see dignified work or a decent work appears there as well. The way that Menti does these things, I believe, is to make words that have been used more than once appear slightly larger. So those larger words in the middle are the ones that seem to be getting a lot of traction. Adaptation and farmers is in there too. This is great, and I can see rights in there. So a lot of the kind of words that we use quite regularly at ETI. I can see collective bargaining appearing for a moment there, stakeholder engagement. Um, yeah, this is great. Please do keep filling that in. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on with my introduction. But it's super helpful to have that sense of what you're thinking in terms of this concept of just transition and also these major concerns that are very much front and center of the agenda these days. So I'm going to just provide a bit of a brief overview of just transitions. I'm sure this will be a recap for many of you, so bear with me, but hopefully it'll be helpful for getting us all on the same page. So in terms of just transitions and that concept and where it comes from, I think it's really important to emphasize that this is a concept, this is a set of principles and priorities and ways of working that was developed by the trade union movement back in the 1970s. So it's certainly not a new concept. However, it has gained a lot of traction, I would say, over the last decade or so, and particularly since its inclusion in the preamble to the Paris Climate Change Agreement back in 2015. Since then, there's been a number of major milestones, some of which we've included on the slide here today. So obviously, the publication of the ILO's Just Transitions Guidelines in 2016 was a really key moment in all of this. And that was followed a few years later by a Just Transition Declaration at COP26 in Glasgow, and then the agreement to set up the Just Transitions Work Programme, which is led by the ILO at COP27. And most recently, towards the end of 2025, there was the decision to establish the Just Transition Mechanism at COP30 in Brazil. And I think what that mechanism indicates is a real appetite to now shift the needle from the what and the why of just transitions to the how. How do we make just transitions a reality in today's societies and today's economies? And so the purpose of that just transition mechanism is just to enhance international cooperation, technical assistance, capacity building, and knowledge sharing to ensure equitable, inclusive just transitions. So a couple of key words there from the decision taken at COP30 that very much echo some of the words appearing on the word cloud just now. So just to broaden things out slightly, as mentioned, Just Transition has gained a lot of traction in climate change discourse and climate change policy making. But of course, we've now learnt that actually we face not only climate change, but a triple planetary crisis, one that includes climate change, but also massive biodiversity loss and also widespread pollution of land, of seas and waterways, and also of the air. So if we begin to bring these notions together, the notion of just transitions and the triple planetary crisis, we'll see on the next slide one of the definitions that's come out of the ILO in terms of just transitions, which I think is a really helpful one. It's quite accessible, it's quite short, but they talk about just transitions as being a process of greening the economy in ways that are fair and inclusive, creating decent work and leaving no one behind. So again, some of that terminology that we saw on the Menti word cloud just a couple of minutes ago. If we kind of layer this concept onto this notion of a triple planetary crisis, what we see is the overlay of decent work on top of these key priorities of preventing climate change and minimizing climate change, reversing biodiversity loss, and reducing and removing pollution. And where we have the overlay of decent work with these three sets of priorities, that's really where we start to see just transition happen in practice. Of course, we can prevent climate change, we can reverse biodiversity loss, we can reduce and remove pollution without providing decent work for workers. It's only when we do so that we have a just transition. Decent work, again, is a concept that comes out of the ILO, and they talk about four pillars of decent work. So the first one of those is employment creation, followed by social protection, and then rights at work, and then social dialogue. And when it comes to rights at work specifically, of course, it's always worth referring back to the five fundamental principles and rights at work as defined by the ILO. So just a quick recap on those. We're talking about freedom of association and collective bargaining, again, something that came up on the word cloud, the elimination of forced labor, the abolition of child labor, the elimination of discrimination, and also, of course, safe and healthy working environments. And all ILO member states agreed to promote and uphold these fundamental principles and rights at work. And so they sit very much at the center of the decent work agenda. So if we now move briefly to SMEP, I won't go into a lot of details, but as mentioned, this is a program supported by UK Government International Development and also by UN Trade and Development. The program management unit is a consortium consisting of Pegasus and South South North, and Faith, who joins us today, is one of the core team members over at South South North. The aim of the program is to address the environmental and human health impacts of the manufacturing sector across Africa and South Asia, and it focuses in on plastics, organic waste and water, leather and tanneries, textiles and apparel, and used lead acid batteries. I won't go into any more detail than that, but hopefully that kind of sets the scene a little bit. I'm now going to hand over, if that's all right, to my colleague Ipek, who's going to talk in more detail about what we've been learning over the last year when it comes to integrating decent work into environmental initiatives. Ipek, over to you.
Thanks, George. Hello, everyone. I am Ipek. It's really great to see so many people joining us today. Today, I want to share some of the practical lessons emerging from ETI's work with the SMEP program. I want to start off by a shout out to all the great work that the grantees are doing in their sector, because a lot of these lessons came directly from conversations with them about what was and what wasn't working in practice. Over the last year, we have been working with the grantees, and a major focus of this work has been understanding what it actually takes in practice to integrate decent work, occupational health and safety, into environmental initiatives and emerging circular supply chains. The lessons I will be talking today comes from the experiences of grantees. Before going into the findings themselves, I want to briefly explain the approach we took throughout this process. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing? Our approach was not to simply deliver trainings. We worked alongside grantees over the time through workshops, practical tools, one-to-one support, and peer learning to understand what actually works. We started with needs assessment and then conversations with them to understand the realities they're dealing with. We then delivered workshops focused on decent work, occupational health and safety, and safeguarding. But the workshops were only one part of the process. Grantees also completed practical coursework around workplace risk assessment. We then held on one-to-one follow-up sessions to review these risk assessments and then discuss practical improvements. Alongside this, we ran communities of practice sessions where grantees came together so they could share challenges and examples of good practice with each other. And then came the briefing papers, which we aimed to capture the lessons from all these activities that I mentioned. And finally, the webinar is where we are today, which I will be sharing these lessons. Next slide, please. So the overall approach. One of the important things for us was not only what we discussed, but how we approach the work as well. And from the beginning, we found that existing business language and frameworks can be quite difficult to engage with. Some frameworks feels too abstract or too disconnected from day-to-day operational realities of the workers. So we deliberately try to take a practical and accessible approach. We went to basics and focused on International Labour Organization's fundamental principles and rights. We spent less time on theory and much more time on implementation. For example, worker-centered approaches to identifying risks. And to name a few, these can be simple workplace risk assessments, hazard mapping, or body mapping. We also tried to meet businesses where they were. Many of these organizations are operating in resource-constrained environments and often within MSME settings. So instead of expecting large-scale changes immediately, we've focused on helping organizations identifying practical and achievable improvements that could later build momentum over time. Peer learning was also extremely important. Hearing examples from organizations facing similar realities often helped make changes feel a bit more achievable. Through this process, some findings and recommendations consistently emerge across the projects, discussions, and the briefing papers. Today, I'm not going to go through the papers one by one or cover every recommendation in detail. Instead, I want to focus on a few of the strongest cross-cutting findings and practical recommendations that appear repeatedly across all the three themes, which are decent work in MSMEs, decent work in informal employment, and decent work in emerging circular supply chains. The full briefing papers will explore these issues in much more detail, including more targeted recommendations for different actors, including businesses, funders, partner organizations, and lead firms. But for now, we can move to the key findings. One of the clear findings was that progress on environmental goals does not automatically lead to progress on decent work. Across many environmental and circular economy initiatives, workers can still experience unsafe working conditions, low pay, informal employment, gender inequality, and limited access to social protection. And many workers who are driving these environmental solutions are still working in difficult and sometimes hazardous conditions, handling contaminated materials, working outdoors in extreme temperatures, waste collection, sorting, and recycling. All these do not mean that environmental initiatives are failing. That is not the message here at all, but it does mean that decent work needs to be integrated intentionally rather than assumed to happen automatically. Next slide, please. Another finding across the projects was that worker-centered approaches tend to be much more effective. Managers alone can miss risks that workers immediately identify. This was especially visible when using tools such as body mapping, hazard mapping, worker-centered risk assessments. Workers understand the realities of their job better than anyone else. So some of the most impactful changes happened when workers themselves started mapping these risks and suggesting solutions. Involving workers directly often resulted in more accurate identification of risk and stronger workplace trust. One example from the SMEP program was a grantee completing a risk assessment which involved workers directly identifying physical strain linked to lifting and repetitive tasks. This risk assessment resulted in practical, quick adjustments that reduced injuries while also improving productivity. Gender-responsive approaches were also important. Women and men often experience workplace risks differently, but women's risks are frequently less visible and less prioritized. These risks become more clear when you include women workers in engagements around risks, because they can tell you better than anyone else what their struggles are. Next slide, please. Across many sectors, informal work is not a side issue. Workers who operate in informal settings are central to how supply chains function. This was especially visible in recycling and waste management. Many workers involved in environmental supply chains still lack written contracts, social protection, stable income, or clear employment relationships. Women and migrant workers were often disproportionately represented in these roles. Often, one important lesson was that formalization cannot simply be imposed from the outside. Workers often have very real, understandable concerns around reduced take-home pay, taxes, loss of flexibility, or just distrust of formal systems, which we have heard repeatedly. So the lesson is not that formalization is unnecessary, but that transition needs to be gradual, practical, and workers need to be informed throughout. The goal here is decent work and not formalization for its own sake. Next slide, please. So if we move to the recommendations, one of the key recommendations across all three briefing papers is to start with practical and visible improvements. Small changes can make a significant difference for workers while also helping build trust and management buy-in. These examples can be better PPE, reducing lifting loads, transport support to workers who work or live in remote areas, heat protection, improved sanitation, workers' communication mechanisms. These are not always expensive interventions, but they can have a real impact on workers' daily lives. In many cases, practical improvements also supported productivity, morale, and workplace relationships as well. Next slide, please. Decent work should not be added later as an add-on. It needs to be integrated from the beginning into program design, safeguarding initiatives, environmental initiatives, business support, and investment decisions. A proactive and a preventative approach is much more effective than trying to fix problems later. As environmental and climate-related programs and initiatives continue to grow, there's a real opportunity to integrate decent work early rather than trying to fix it afterwards. Next slide, please. Workers know workplace risks and operational realities best. Where workers were involved in identifying problems, shaping solutions, changes were often more sustainable and more trusted by the workplace. Across this process with grantees, we saw the importance of strengthening worker voice, agency, and representation. These are not only important for identifying workplace problems early and building trust between workers and management, but also they're important pathways towards freedom of association and collective bargaining. Building these foundations is not always straightforward, particularly in MSMEs and informal contexts, but they are essential for creating more proactive, preventative, and right-respecting workplaces. Next slide, please. So if I could briefly summarize the lessons we learned from SMEP, they would be improving decent work often starts with listening workers. Practical changes can build safety, dignity, and trust. And environmental progress and decent work cannot be treated separately. If the transition towards greener industries is going to be truly just, workers' rights and their working conditions need to be part of the conversation from the beginning. These are obviously just a small part of the briefing papers, and I just wanted to capture some cross-cutting findings and recommendations, but we will be publishing the 3 briefing papers where these recommendations and findings explored in much more detail, including tailored recommendations for businesses, partner organizations, funders who are working in these sectors. And finally, I want to say thank you to all the grantees, all the workers, specialists, and sector leads who shared their experiences and expertise with us throughout this process. And thank you for listening to me today as well.
Thank you, Ipek. I hope that provided everyone with a bit of an overview of some of these key findings and recommendations emerging from this work. We're now going to hand over to Faith, who is the Jessie lead at South South North, to talk through some of the key lessons related to gender equality and social inclusion specifically. Faith, thanks for joining us today. I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, George. My name is Faith Gara, and I work at South North on the SMAP project as JC project manager. Today, I want to focus on just transitions, not as a theory, but a practical, gender inclusive, and responsive design choice for manufacturing and circular economy innovation. I will be referring to some of SMAP projects, so a slide will pop up with a QR code and some of their details so that you can understand the context as I speak. As manufacturing shifts towards greener production, we see rapid innovation, new materials, processes, and business models. But these transitions also shape jobs, skills, risks, and power in ways that are not neutral and that often affect women, youth, and informal workers. As IPEC just highlighted in the previous presentation, marginalized groups risk. I'm sorry, please move to the next slide. Marginalized groups risk being excluded from new opportunities, exposed to greater risks, or losing livelihoods altogether when transitions are not designed with inclusion in mind. Just Transition also recognized that environmental progress and outcomes do not move together. I'm sure IPEC made that clear previously. They ask a simple but essential question: who benefits from change? Who bears the risk? And whose voices shape the transition? So SMAP works with manufacturing and circular economy innovators ranging from early pilots and technically advanced projects in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Across all these contexts, innovation entered systems already shaped by gender inequality, informalities, and limited protections. Without a JC lens, secular transitions risk reinforcing exclusion by concentrating these upcoming new opportunities among those with existing power and access. SMAP experience shows that when JC considerations and safeguarding measures are integrated early and intentionally, they strengthen delivery. When introduced later, they become reactive and less effective. Next slide, please. So JC in SMAP evolved from a cross-country principle into an operational driver of inclusive transition, demonstrating that inclusion delivers impact when embedded in how innovation is designed, implemented, and scaled. SMAP procurements, for example, nudged applicants to think about social inclusion, safeguarding, and community benefits from the proposal stage. The proposed interventions were then embedded in contracts. An inclusive lens from the SMAP, from the get-go in the project, helped shape that when systems changed, marginalized groups moved with the change rather than absorbing new risk or being excluded entirely from emerging green jobs. Next slide, please. It is also important to be clear about the type of businesses SMAP supports and why JC is central to their ability to scale responsibly. SMAP-funded projects and business mostly operate where informality, skills gaps, weak infrastructure are real constraints, and in value chains where women, youth, and informal workers are often excluded from technical roles and decision-making. Secular models rely on people. We saw that clearly from the previous presentations. Therefore, these waste speakers, operators, technicians, and communities are so vital to how we scale and businesses grow. So it is vital that they are treated as valuable assets. Next slide, please. Reverse Resources offers a good example here on inclusion. Their digital circularity platform was designed around existing informal sorting and aggregation practices. Instead of requiring immediate formalization of these informal players, this approach enabled informal workers, many of them women and youth, to transition gradually onto the platform, therefore reducing exclusion risk while improving data quality, uptake, and long-term viability for the project. Next, please. The Kenya National Cleaner Production Center is also a good example on inclusion and Jesse. Their work was deliberately combined with Jesse responsive business development, helping enterprises redesign roles, training, and engagement so women, youth, and marginalized groups could participate meaningfully in resource-efficient cleaner production that they were promoting. These examples demonstrate that environmental protection and social inclusion go hand in hand in building resilient communities, workers, and businesses. Next, please. What worked well in SMEP was when Jesse translated into everyday operational decisions, not just policy commitments. Yes, SMEP grantees said to present policies. What is your policy on this and this? But what worked was how this was put into practice. Next, please. For example, at Mananas Fiber in Kenya, roles were designed to be accessible to women. Workloads were adapted during pregnancy, and workers had individual PPE and access to sanitation, even in the field-based settings that Mananasi works in. These measures addressed gender-specific health and safety risks and enabled women to participate safely in the new green manufacturing roles. Next, please. In the Jivo Warwick project, recognizing and progressively formalizing informal workers, many of whom face intersecting vulnerabilities, improved occupational health and safety, stabilized labor supply, and reduced exploitation risk within circular value chain in their context. Across these examples, inclusion acted as a risk prevention, not remediation. Gender-responsive design reduced safety incidences, prevented exclusion from new opportunities, and supported workers through transition, while also improving productivity, retention, and trust. The key lesson from SMEP is do no harm inclusive systems are the foundation upon which fair access, participation, and empowerment is built. Next, please. Lessons from SMEP also show that JC considerations help shape innovation scaling with minimum displacement and exclusion from harm. We saw that inclusive innovation consistently expands available skills by removing the gendered access barriers. Community engagement and participation in local projects reduces resistance to new production models, and context-specific occupation, health, and safety improves workers' morality and capacity while reducing downtime and safety incidences. All these inclusion measures are not just good for workers, but they are good for business as well, which is a main focus in SMEP. How do you scale your business model responsibly and sustainably? Next slide, please. As SMEP progressed, the program deepened its understanding of how to operationalize Leave No One Behind in gendered and informal labor context. This is where ETI comes in how they helped our grantees to understand occupational health and safety and decent work. One important learning was the value of clarity. SMEP grantees performed well and best when expectation on gender equality, labor standards, safeguarding were explicit, practical, and linked to delivery, rather than just treated as reporting exercises. Another learning was the importance of pairing quantitative data with lived experience. Gender disaggregated headcounts matter, but they do not capture whether women, youth are safe, fairly paid, able to progress, or meaningfully involved in decision-making. This was particularly evident in platforms like Reverse Resources, where engaging informal workers was essential to understand how digital innovation interacted with existing practices and where exclusion risks could emerge. SMEP pilots reinforced the benefit of early safeguards. When hygiene, PPE, and safety systems were designed with inclusion, with gender and informality in mind from the beginning, businesses avoid disruption later, and workers are better able to adapt to new technologies. Overall, SMEP showed that learning by doing strengthened the ability to support an inclusive, just transition in the challenging context SMEP operates. Next, please. SMEP experience shows just transition can be delivered more systematically by embedding JES at the core. To begin with, JESI and safeguarding must be integrated at inception with clear and adequate budgets and JESI champions, MEL systems that measure meaningful progress. Structured inclusion and risk mitigation plans should be mandatory and explicitly addressing gender inequality, inclusion, informality, and community impact. Minimum standards such as sanitation, PPE, fair pay, and gender-specific needs and risk must be non-negotiable from day one. Capacity-centered support is essential so businesses can operationalize inclusion in practice. This is where ETI helped us as SMEP to actually operationalize what occupational health and safety looks like in grantees context. Also, leveraging partnerships across industry and government and academia to scale JESI impact is necessary. This helps to build inclusive practices into policy, strengthen supply chain accountability, generate evidence, and enable systematic long-term transformative change. Finally, transitions must be measured not only by outputs, but whether women, marginalized workers experience improved dignity, safety, and opportunity. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Faith. That was an extremely rich presentation. I'm sure many of the participants will want to know, more details and the thinking behind so much of the work that you've been doing. Our colleague Stacey has been putting links in the chat. So Faith mentioned several of the projects and programs supported by SMEP. Some of those links will enable you to read a bit more and learn a bit more about the great work that's being done. But please do keep the questions flowing on the Q&A. I'm trying to respond to those as we go, and it's great to see that engagement. So we would now like to hand over to our colleague V, who joins us from River Recycle. River Recycle is one of the grantees supported by the SMEP program and has been doing some really fascinating work and really impactful work in Ghana. So V, over to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, George. Hello, everybody. So my name is V. I'm here to represent our consortium of River Recycle, Beach Cleanup Ghana, and Beaches Africa, to tell you stories and what we've done in the Ghana Cleanup Project, which is under the SMEP program in regarding to decent work and implementing safeguarding principles in our project implementation. Next slide, please. So to start off my presentation, I would just like to give you an overview of what we do, just to give you a bit of context of our stories later on. So in Ghana, what we do is that we facilitate value chain for the plastic waste from collection to transportation, and then to pre-processing and recycling. So in these steps, next slide, please. Yes, so in these different stages of our value chain, you can see that we encounter different hazards or different risks that we need different mitigation solutions. And how we do that is, next slide, please. So one of the most important point of our work in Ghana is the collaboration with our partners. And in collaboration with partners, I don't mean just to Beach Cleanup Ghana or Beaches Africa. I meant on the municipal agency, the government agency, and even SMEP team, who actually help us a lot with advices and support in terms of decent work and safeguarding principles. So we work collaborative with our partners. Since we are from different countries also. So River Cycle is from Finland, where our local partners are from Ghana. So we need to align our safeguarding policies across partners. And then we work together to co-develop what we call as standard operating procedures, where we implement that to our project workers. For example, and you can see that some of the identified hazards that we found out or we drafted actually before the project implementation. This is for our river cleaning sites, is that our worker will be exposed to water-related risk since they are very close to water bodies. They would be exposed to sun, to the weather risk. So that's why we have specialized protective gears for them, which would include a life vest, and then waterproof boots, face mask to fight up the smell of the waste, which is quite bad. If you visit our site, you can see that. And then one of the very important for us is that we need to have regular open discussions with the workers. That is super important because one of the last risks that we identify is the lack of washing areas. It didn't come to us at the very beginning of the project. It came to us because our workers brought them up in those meetings. So we didn't really thought of it. And then our workers expressed that they need some washing before they go home after work. So we talked to them and we acknowledged that is actually a very reasonable needs for our staff. So what we did is that we talked to a resort nearby, since we work on the beach. We clean up the beach. So what we do is actually very beneficial to the resorts nearby, to the hotel nearby. So one of the resorts actually agree for our staff to use their washing areas for their security personnel. So that was resolved, but that's only, and that was resolved and added into our documents for our staff to be able to wash themselves before going home. So that to be said, we consider standard operating procedures as a living document and it's get updated continuously with our staff together. So next slide, please. So in terms of decent work, what we actually consider or ponder a lot is formalizations of our workforce. We have been talking about this since the beginning of the project. And to do this, we need kind of like a transition. At first, when we brought it up with our workers, we didn't realize that we would get some hesitance and even resistance from them. Because formalizations, we always thought, oh, it's a good thing. It's always a good thing to do it. But then we realized why they were so against it because the tax payment, the social contribution. So they need to deduct from their pay. So that formalizations to our workers at the time, it just means less income, less take-home income. So hence there was resistance from them. It took us, I guess, a couple months to sit down with our staff, to sit down with our financial teams, to thought of a plan for salary budget planning of how to actually ensure our staff take-home income, while we can still pay their social securities, while we can still pay their tax. So we came up with a restructuring salary plan is that we added on a transportation compensation, which is actually tax-free under the Ghanaian law. So that would just match our workers' salary. So match their take-home income before the formalization. So that helps with the transition. But that, I think the discussion actually went over for like a couple months to 3 months before we can actually implement that. So what I would just say is that decent work or implementing any changes is required careful sensitization and also very transparent communication with your workers, because sometimes you don't really know how your changes would impact their life and their work. So that's our lesson learned in implement our projects. So I guess next slide, I guess that's the final slide. And then thank you everybody for your time. Back to George.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, V. It's such fascinating work that you've been doing in Ghana. And I think I remember, the first conversation that we had with V and her colleagues at River Recycle. One of the things that really stood out for us was this very collaborative approach that River Recycle are taking with their partners and really working in genuine partnership with the local organizations who are part of this project and seeking to solve problems and challenges collaboratively together. So really a great example. And you can read more online, and V has also provided her email address if you have any follow-up questions on that. I got a question in the chat that relates to some challenges with some of the hyperlinks that we've been putting in the chat, where you can read a bit more about some of these projects and programs. Apologies if you're struggling to open those hyperlinks. They do seem to be working for some people, but not all. Stacey's suggestion is if you're struggling to open one, try copying it and pasting it into your browser instead. Sometimes that overcomes some of the challenges. But at this point in time, and I think we're running roughly on schedule in terms of timing, which is both good and surprising. I think we're going to hand over now to Glenn. And Glenn joins us from UN Trade and Development, who are a technical partner on the SMET program and have been providing a lot of technical assistance over the last few years, working very closely with the different SMET portfolios. So Glenn, keen to get your perspective on these issues of integrating human rights and decent work into environment programs. Over to you.
Thanks, George, and thanks to the ETI team for the great work you've been doing with SMET. It's really helped the program achieve a lot more, especially in terms of understanding the gaps in the working conditions and the social environment of some of the projects. Because when we started the program, although one of the focuses was human health. It's something that's not as often as straightforward and easy to target decent working conditions, and salaries can be very complicated as well in different contexts than as environmental interventions, which are often easier to communicate outwards when we're making progress, and progress is also often more obvious, and the interventions are often easier as well and simpler and more straightforward. So what I want to do is try and just sum up a couple of the things that were said, and highlight a couple of things that were said rather than add anything new. Because I think it's all been said. I think it's been a very broad and data-based conversation that's been had. So thank you to the projects for that, to ETI for bringing a lot of that out. It's been really interesting. So UNCTAD supports the integration of labor standards into green industrial policy. So when governments are making a policy for the green transition in any of the sectors or all of their sectors, the integration of labor standards is really important from the start. And so the policies are designed with these standards, referring to specific standards, ILO standards, for example. And this can create an opportunity to create decent jobs. Because often in all parts of the world, governments try and create new jobs, or industries create new jobs, but they're not always decent jobs for many reasons. So it's important that these jobs are decent, that we're moving in the right direction from a social point of view as well as an environmental point of view, because this isn't automatically the case. For example, if we take plastic recycling, there's a lot of informality, and there's a lot of dangerous to more or less extent jobs that are created because of this circular economy that we're transitioning to. So it's very important to be aware of this and to have it as an integral part of of the plastics recycling, plastics recovery, or transition to other substitute materials, which also can have their new challenges that can come out. V, for example, pointed to some new challenges they didn't think about before that came as a result of them establishing and growing the business in Ghana, recovering the plastics. And then finally, the just transition, as it's already been defined by George, so I'm not going to go into any of that, but it needs to be intentional. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen by itself necessarily. So it needs to be intentional. It needs to go hand in hand with work to clean up our environment or to green industry. And this means that governments need to look at, in their policy, they need to prioritize social protection and retraining and have active labor market policies to really make sure that greener economies mean decent work opportunities for not just for people in specific areas where these projects are happening, but broadly, because there may be negative impacts in other parts of the country or in other industries that need to be taken into account when transitioning to a greener, more sustainable economy. And we need to avoid deepening inequalities because we can see all over the world that inequalities are growing, and the green transition could deepen inequalities if we don't take into account the impacts on the livelihoods of people currently working in all industries. And transparency is something that there are various transparency tools being developed as well as part of the SMET program, and this can be a very useful tool for governments, for companies, and for the consumers to understand the impacts, social and environmental, and be able to act in their different ways to support a just transition. I think I'll end there to make sure we don't go over time. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Glenn. Thanks for joining us today and thanks for sharing your insights. It's really good to have you with us. And I would absolutely echo Glenn's key point there. I think that from our experience of working closely with the SMEP program, it's clear that we have to be intentional about decent work. If we are not intentional, then green economy initiatives could and may deepen social and economic inequalities. And so bringing a very intentional approach to addressing decent work deficits is absolutely crucial. And as Glenn says, there is a role for government in terms of government policies. There's also a role for businesses themselves, whether they are lead firms sourcing from global supply chains or local MSMEs, providing work opportunities locally. There's also a role for NGOs and support organizations who are providing business development support to these green economy initiatives that engage with the private sector. And of course, there's a key role for funders and investors as well. So absolutely agree with Glenn on the importance of intentionality and designing that in from the outset, as Ipek and Faith both emphasized. One of the things that we wanted to let you know is that Ipek and I have been over the last couple of months trying to kind of zoom out from the detail of all the support work that we have been working on with SMEP grantees and try and kind of articulate and synthesize the key lessons, many of which Ipek has discussed today. And I think some of those key messages have been reinforced by Faith and by Glenn as well. And we've documented those in 3 papers that we're about to publish. So one focuses on supporting decent work in micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs. One looks at decent work for workers in informal employment, and one looks at decent work within emerging circular supply chains and green industry industries. All the papers include some case studies of SMEP grantees, including River Recycle, who you heard from today. And as part of that research process, we sense checked and discussed a lot of our kind of thinking and findings and recommendations with experts from across the sector more broadly. And that included researchers and academics, other NGOs, other labor rights organizations, people from within the trade union movement as well. And so we would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who participated in the research, who shared their time and their insights and their experiences so generously. We really appreciate that, and we hope we've done justice to your insights in those papers. We will share a follow-up email after this webinar, including links to these papers, so you can download and read them yourselves. On the next slide, I think we have included our email addresses. We appreciate that this is quite a short webinar today, and we've covered a lot of ground. So no doubt there are further questions and comments and perhaps feedback that you'd like to share. Do feel free to get in touch with any of us, and we're always happy to continue the conversation. I think it's about 1 minute past the hour here in the UK, so I better wrap up. But just to say, we have a few more insights webinars on the agenda. We've got one that focuses on our new ETI strategy coming up in June. And then in July, we've got two, one looking at freedom of association within human rights due diligence, and one looking at the EU forced labour regulation, a very important piece of policy that's come into force. Please do keep an eye out for those if those are topics that are relevant to you. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. Thanks for all the great questions that you've included in the Q&A. As I say, we will send out a follow-up email with links to the slides, the recording, and these papers. And thanks very much to all our speakers today, to EPEC, to Faith, to V, and to Glenn for all the hard work they've put in preparing the presentations and their interventions today. We hope that you found it useful and insightful, and we hope we can continue this discussion with you. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.